As I said, my name is Robin of Manjano Media. I am the project manager for the Black Girl Live project. It's a storytelling accelerator. We started about 2 years ago, and it's the second time we are running this project as the fellowship. It's also the first time we are inviting guest lecturers to speak with us, and also the public to join in on this process beyond the showcase. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time tonight. It's good to be able to share this with everyone. If you don't know Tiisetso, she's a South African playwright, a theatre maker, a producer, and an educator. And she's known for her award-winning and acclaimed play, Sainthood. Tiisetso holds a BA in Politics and International Studies, Philosophy and Dramatic Arts from Rhodes University, and also a BA in Honours in Directing for Stage from UCT. In her work, Tiisetso strives to make provocative content focused on themes of social politics, history, and violence in contemporary South Africa. So that's Tiisetso. Welcome, and thank you for your time tonight, and thank you for what you're about to share.
No, thank you. Thank you for the house rules. I just want to express to everybody that I did change the title of the talk. After revising my notes last night at like midnight, I said, no, man, this is about effective communication. So the title of the talk is The Storyteller as Effective Cultural Communicator. And I think that title is more effective. And yes, I would love for cameras to be on if possible, so I can see your faces. I'm a performer at heart, and I feed off of from the audience, so that'd be great. And then in terms of lighting, it's sunset time here in Cape Town, and so the lighting in my flat will change gradually over time, and I will do my best to facilitate an easy transition of that. And lastly, before I begin, I hope I don't go on for too long. I have a lot to say and I get very excited. So please engage with this as a conversation rather than a lecture. Sit back, relax, and hopefully enjoy. All right. So in starting, firstly, I want to start with some thank yous before I get into it. I'd want to thank Manjano Media, Koleka, and Robin for the Black Girl Live project. I hope that they understand the magnitude of what they're doing with this endeavor, and I'm in immense awe of what they're doing, and I'm profoundly grateful and humbled to be here today. And thank you to everyone in the Zoom room, and hopefully in the future, someone watching this back, for taking the time to have a peek at what I'll be engaging with today. Hopefully this is something that you can use as an in addition to, that what I will play with today is in addition to the telling of the stories that are in your heart, your soul, or your dreams. In that being said, this exploration will be speaking more to your head than to your heart. As Robin so kindly mentioned in my introduction, I've always been interested in the marriage of disciplines across the humanities when it comes to telling a story. And you've got all these disciplines that are all trying to understand and communicate what it means to be human. And that's very overwhelming, yet so telling about how much you can say and how to say it. Now, this exploration began, as most stories do, as an exploration, a stirring in my heart, particularly in high school when I was exposed to the dramatic arts and the narratives that I thought would speak to my heart, but they were not matching. The maths was not mathing, and I was not in an environment or exposed to mainstream storytelling that was enthusiastic in conducting the necessary checks and balances of whether this representation of Blackness was correct, balanced, or even a little bit affirming. And my teenage brain recognized it as an injustice, and my teenage brain thought to remedy it by pursuing a creative arts degree alongside a law degree, because injustices are remedied by the law, apparently. So this is a methodology I decided to embark on, and I'm still aggressively embarking on. And I ended up doing a law degree. I didn't end up doing a law degree, actually, alongside my dramatic arts degree, but I pursued politics and philosophy to supplement my drama degree. Yes, the politics and the philosophy supplemented the dramatic arts degree so I could find avenues of communication to make stories from a place of a greater understanding. And as a baseline, I think that there's merit in that there's innovation in the marriage of the head and the heart as a method in finding alternatives, whether they're big or small. So I invite you as an audience to bring all the stirrings in your heart, all the stirrings in your dreams, in your soul, because there's no formula when it comes to the matters of the heart. And I will bring in the cerebral organization in hopefully communicating those stories as effectively as possible. So I was tasked, or rather given the provocation, to think about and play with the idea of the future of storytelling. And I immediately recognized that though it's exciting to think about the possibilities are endless. And storytelling as a practice is quite broad. In its most recognizable form, it sits in the arts, which is communicated through creative writing, like novels, plays, short stories, poetry, communicated through live performance, such as music, poetry, performance art, and visual arts. And when we start crossing the border of storytelling in forms that are not as immediately recognizable, such as architecture, for example, right? Though they're not as immediately recognizable, they're just as significant in the story that they tell and the story that they represent. And we can begin to note the unconscious role that they play in how we see the world and what they tell us about the world. So in marrying the arts and mathematics, right, I spoke about architecture. I'll branch it out further into infrastructure. What does architecture and infrastructure as a storytelling method tell us about a time, tell us about a community, tell us about a culture, tell us about a history? Like the image of a white picket fence, right? Which is a piece of infrastructure made of what? It's made of wood traditionally, and then it's painted white. But it's a structure that's constructed from everyday materials, but somehow supplies the social language to represent the ideal American family. Now, to bring that particular point home here in South Africa, what story does the burning of a community of shacks, the throwing of feces at a statue of an apartheid facilitator, or the burning of South Africa's parliament, all of them, the shack, the statue, and parliament, as pieces of infrastructure or architecture that can't physically or creatively speak for themselves, like a national anthem, Nkalagata, or Captain Spandi Sailor would say about South Africa. And those songs in particular, and how South Africans engage with them, is very loaded and fascinating, but I digress. The shack, the statue, and parliament, which are made up of everyday materials, are assigned particular meanings, assigned a particular importance because of who built them, where they were built, and when they were built. And depending on who you talk to and what stories they were exposed to about these everyday materialized structures, I think it would be interesting, or rather it would be an interesting exercise to ask different people which horrific story, the shack burning, the poop on the statue, or parliament burning, which story holds the most significance in best representing what South Africa currently stands for, or rather how South African society currently looks like. And in transitioning to another form of storytelling, a form that might significantly shape how those infrastructures are seen is through traditional media and social media. So we've gone through the traditional storytelling forms of the creative arts. Now we're moving into architecture as storyteller, now media as storyteller. And an interesting example of this is how the media looked at something as simple as clothing to tell a story. And a story that I always look at, and I looked at in my honors paper when I was at UCT, through the social language that something like a piece of clothing or a white picket fence might represent, I'm not comparing the events of these pieces of clothing, but rather the what's the word I'm looking for? The iconization, if I can make up a word, of what these pieces of clothing represent and the two women at the helm of them. One of the pieces of clothing being a pink Chanel dress that was worn by First Lady of the United States, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, and the blue dress worn by the mistress of Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky. Again, I want to emphasize that I'm not speaking about the events that led to these iconic pieces of clothing and their stories being told, but rather I want to look at the media's lens and how they've looked at two arguably important pieces or symbols that are very definitive of an African-American, we're not talking about Barack Obama here, but they play very definitive parts of an American presidential narrative, but they were decidedly handled with very different levels of care when archiving their importance to this narrative. If you look at Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis's blood-stained pink Chanel suit that was as a result of the assassination of her husband, and I chose not to show her clothing because I think there's a level of sensitivity that I must keep in mind when it comes to the audience that I'm presenting to. When you look at her clothing or her pink Chanel suit, the media told a story of national tragedy. It told a story of the epitome of aspirational femininity for American women at that time. It told a story of a horrific end to a marriage. It was definitive to a presidency, and it's considered a piece of American history and should be preserved as such and will be preserved as such. There are tactics, there are institutions and strategies that are put in place to make sure that that particular piece of clothing and what it symbolized is put away to be archived and in the future presented in a museum for other people to see because of what it represents. Now, when you're looking at it, it's just a piece of clothing. Monica Lewinsky's semen-stained blue Gap dress. The media told the story of, if I can make up a word, Jezebelism, a possible end to a marriage, a definite end to a presidency due to her affair with Bill Clinton. It got him impeached. But it's also a piece of American history that should be preserved as such, but will not be preserved as such. That it's framed as something that should not be archived for the American people to engage with in a greater narrative of what defined, just like Jackie Kennedy's dress defined the end of a presidency, Monica Lewinsky's blue dress also defined the end of a presidency. But because of the lens in which, or rather the storytelling of the journalists, the political consultants, the strategists told the story, it is not archived as seen as a narrative that is important enough to be in the public sphere. And it's those gaps that are a point of concern, but also a point of innovation. Gaps are created by biases, prejudices, and sanitations, which can be seen as a failure to communicate accurately, but is still frighteningly effective in reaching its audience. And there's a responsibility on the part of the storyteller to be mindful of that intersection because it's possibly very heavily prevalent in our everyday exchanges of stories and experiences. So now moving from the storytelling of media then, we move on to oral storytelling that does not only involve Gogo's bedtime stories to you as a child, but it also sits in the broken telephone involved in gossip. It sits in academic lectures. It sits in religious sermons. It also sits in the rally cries and speeches of a politician promising jobs. Now, considering all of these forms of storytelling, the traditional creative storyteller, the media, architecture, infrastructure, oral storytelling, the gossip, the priest, the politician, they all play a role in the ecosystem of society, of a particular culture and a particular generation. And as a creative storyteller, how do you practically interpret contemporary rules of storytelling that does not quickly become la-di-da in trying to encompass all the perspectives and forms of that kind of storytelling? And that's how I interpreted the provocation that was presented to me. And I will attempt to break down how to practically engage with it with as much clarity and consideration as I could possibly muster. So in that being said, at this point in this engagement, I hope that you recognize that this is not a lecture, but rather it's an offering based on some, not all observations in the forms of storytelling that I mentioned. This is an interpretation, it's a consideration, it's a provocation in itself, and I invite you to engage with it as you see fit. So I decided to practically engage with contemporary tools of storytelling by looking at storytelling as a communicative tool, which must evolve with time. It must evolve with culture. It must evolve with the generation it exists in communicating a message effectively. The key words and phrases being a tool that communicates a message effectively. Now, when you look at storytelling like that, it sounds like a strategy taken from the playbook of a communication strategist. And that's exactly what I'm alluding to. Exploring or marrying the forms of communication strategies found in media and or politics or business, and marrying it with forms of traditional rules of storytelling. And I'm a playwright, so I'll be exploring traditional rules of storytelling from a creative writing lens. And I don't think that innovations are completely limited to that form, but it's the form that I'm familiar with. And hopefully this is something that will equip any storyteller of any form with some interesting weapons in your arsenal to become an effective communicator of the culture of the time and the generation. Because Dr. Cornel West, who's an American philosopher, says that every generation of the human species has to come to terms with how to love, how to live, and how to deal with catastrophe, and how to preserve their style. And I think a storyteller has the luxury to address life, love, catastrophe, all while preserving it in style, because isn't that our job as storytellers? Now, I think this is the point where you can get some notes out, your notebooks out, with a foundation that is encompassed by two thoughts that say something about this day and age that we currently live in and what it means to communicate to a contemporary audience. Number one is that a story is not entirely new. And the common phrase is that stories, tropes, stereotypes, archetypes, narrative structures that define those stories are designed to, number one, make writing easier, and number two, make it easier for an audience to consume. So thus they are recycled. And when looking at stories that I experienced in many different forms, whether it's visual arts or a play or a movie or anything like that, and that's a subjective point of view of what I assume to be innovative, but in looking at what I saw as innovative or breaths of fresh air, looked at those tropes, archetypes, stereotypes, narrative structures from a place of revision and inquiry rather than recycling. And an interesting example of this was thinking about my own father as an audience member. My father is not necessarily interested in fictional works. He's a person who best consumes through non-fictional writings like essays, news articles. And I thought of this through the thread of the story of David and Goliath. David and Goliath, in a creative writing form, illustrates an archetype of the underdog facing and triumphing over a large obstacle or adversary. And it's an archetype that is replicated endlessly in all sorts of creative media and creative writing, whether it's someone overcoming the obstacles that the high school bully represents, or a team winning a competition that is always won by another team. Now, journalists and nonfiction writer Malcolm Gladwell, who is known to creatively write about the unexpected implications within the social sciences, famously revised the story of David and Goliath when he wrote the story from the perspective that scientifically, giants in real life are usually that size because of medical conditions. Something in the endocrine system is working differently to that of a normal-sized human, which for some giants causes them to have eyesight issues or even a complete loss of eyesight. So narratively speaking, from that point of view, of course, Goliath was going to lose. Of course, the giant was going to lose. He can't see. He can't see what's around him, and he can't see David. So of course, he was never going to win the argument or the fight between them. So now, Malcolm Gladwell, looking at it from that lens, took the archetype and made it more interesting, and it provided for avenues that busted open where that narrative can go. So we can recognize that recycling a set formula comes with a sense of security, because reboots are popping up everywhere all the time. Because looking back and nostalgia is something that's comforting, but in looking forward to the future, these tropes and narrative structures mostly sit in a westernized lens that is sanitized to reach the greater masses or to cater to the sensitivities of a particular audience. But in looking at a story that isn't new from a place of revision and inquiry, it becomes it becomes a place to unlearn and relearn. That is not to say that narratives and a way of storytelling that go against the grain are instantly subversive, because then the stories of people of color and people who identify as queer often quickly become defined by how they subvert things, rather than how they remedy the recycled and sanitizing of existing narratives that need to be revised completely and understood more intimately. That's point number one, our foundation being revision and inquiry rather than recycling stories that have been told before. The second foundational point is looking at storytelling from the perspective of designing a story rather than writing or just telling a story. And I base this off of something that a drama teacher of mine would say after a showing. She would watch it and always tell the maker, whether it's myself or my classmates, she'd ask the question, why should I care? And initially that sounded harsh, right? But if you're gonna have people coming to a place to watch your performance or buy or read your story, there's a level of business-like care in recognizing that the audience has invested time and possibly money to listen to witness, to read whatever you're presenting to them. And it's not just enough to tell a story to fulfill a personal need to express yourself. You need to design a story for your audience to get something out of it. Now, in designing something akin to what an engineer or an architect or a fashion designer would do, alludes to strategy and intention. It alludes to a customization to fit a particular mold, style, culture, environment, or personality that does not have everything to do with the writer or the designer themselves. And I think there's benefit for a storyteller to think about making a story in that light. Because thinking of it in this way assists in starting to think effectively, so you're not stuck in concept, so you have a clearer way of finding a beginning, middle, and end. And it also saves the storyteller from wanting to tell a story that's for everybody, because that's an unnecessarily complicated way of viewing your job. It's okay to be specific, because then it's easier to design a story and thus communicate effectively. Now, keeping in mind those foundations, particularly foundation number one of a story being revised, in marrying communication strategies with traditional rules of storytelling, let's look at quickly, or rather revise the structures of storytelling in a traditional sense, because you can't challenge or break the rules if you don't know what the rules are. And when I speak of traditional storytelling, I'm not looking at something that's inherently cultural, but rather looking at structures that you might find or encounter in creative writing within an English department or a drama department, where across the board, there's a baseline of a story must always have a beginning, middle, and end. And then you put in place the 4 Ps of storytelling, which is person, who's in the story, place, where's the story taking place, plot, what's the conflict and the journey in resolving it, and purpose, going back to the idea of why should anyone care about this, where is the pulse of the story. So beginning, middle, and end, married with person, place, plot, and purpose, then becomes fleshed out through dramatic structure. Traditional dramatic structure, which is used in film, books, and plays, has an introduction where the necessary introductions are made of the main character, protagonist, backstory, the driving force behind the story, which is usually the incident, the problem, the complication that the main character has to face. This is how stakes, this is how what is at stake is created. Moving from introduction, we then go into rising action, where we have the main character's journey in trying to resolve the problem, trying to resolve the complication and the obstacles that they face in solving that problem or solving that complication. It usually comes in the form of an antagonist who makes things difficult for them. Then from introduction, rising action, we go to the climax. That's the turning point where suspense often creeps in, because now the problem must be confronted dead on. And now we try and unravel in an interesting manner how they'll resolve it. At this point, it might be unclear because all sorts of revelations are made. Characters have strategies to deceive or sway matters in their own favor. Then we have the falling action, and that's how the turning point unravels. How they solve this matter. I may have said that already. Then we get to the resolution, the conclusion, the solving of the problem, the answering of questions, the tying up of loose ends, the end. There it is. There are our traditional structures, our security blanket to fall back on in putting narratives together. It's safe, it's nice, but the communicator of the culture now has to engage with point number 2 of effectively designing a story for an audience who's not as passive anymore in consuming what's presented to them. Because in this day and age, audiences are making it clear that the storyteller has a responsibility and an accountability to present them with something that is thoroughly considered and enticing. Especially, now getting to my next point, especially if the story being presented to them is packaged as something that will get them closer to some sort of truth. Not the truth, some sort of truth. And that's where things become shoo-shoo, things become tricky in how effective your story is in communicating to your audience. So now we have the bracket of communicating the truth. How does a contemporary storyteller in a world of alternative facts, opposing views, individual experiences engage with the truth? Everything we communicate, we personally express as a truth. The storyteller might answer the question, what's this piece about? What's the story about? With an answer that's a variation of, this piece is what it truly means to XYZ. This piece is exploring the truth about XYZ. And in understanding the precariousness of the truth, a storyteller structurally benefits or diversifies their avenues of effectively communicating to an audience if the story that they tell engages with the 3 categories of the truth that I took from a scientific lens. There is personal truth, which is based off of one's values, experiences, emotions, prejudices. And then there's the political truth, which is based on one's social circumstances and variables defined by identity and ideology. And then we have the objective truth, which is unbiased fact. It's irrespective of social circumstance, individual experience, prejudices. It's irrespective of any other variables because it cannot be refuted that this is the fact in its objectivity. Often, storytellers lean towards 1 or 2 of those truths, mostly the personal and the political truths. But the sweet spot is a story that hits all 3 truths in some way. So the personal truth is often guided by feeling and heart, and it leaves a vulnerability to dabble in narratives that want to achieve a story where there's a hard wrong and a hard right, not ripe. Double narratives where there's a hard wrong and a hard right. And in that being said, it's not easy to pursue a narrative where there's a hard wrong and hard right because it alienates a particular audience. Political truth often starts from what is believed to be a political truth, or rather a personal truth in an ideological form. And that can sometimes be the sole driver of a narrative that neglects the humanity of an audience, because then you want to examine it as a hard social truth that invites hard oppositions, again, invites a hard wrong and a hard right. In that being said, let's not say that that's not a narrative to pursue, but it's something to think about when you're communicating to an audience. I only speak about just writing a story from an objective truth. That's too cerebral and too vanilla. You know, it's motionless without heart and humanity and conflict to make it exciting. Now, there's disciplines that purely deal with one of those truths, whether it's a scientist who presents society with objective truths, a politician leaning on political versions of the truth, or a lying partner avoiding a personal truth to avoid accountability. A storyteller, whether a novelist, a journalist, a PR specialist, has the ability to make the everyday extraordinary by engaging with all three of those truths to present a more compelling and better weighted account of how the truth may appear in a narrative. Now, on this thread of effectively communicating a truth, know who you are talking to. There is something that is often told to actors in the dramatic arts when they're investigating a way for their character to relate to another character, and how they communicate to a character what they want. As a storyteller, what is your audience to you? Is your audience a collaborator? Is your audience an ally, a bystander, a critic, a student or novice of sorts? You know your audience by recognizing your audience's interests, prejudices, and expectations, because then you can accurately design a story to clarify the intention of the story that you're trying to communicate to them. Is the story that you're trying to communicate to the audience a story to try and persuade, to try and motivate, to inform, to negotiate, to problem solve, to entertain, or to educate? Because when you think about it like that, when you ask yourself those questions, whichever one you engage with requires a different way of communicating effectively. That's bringing us almost to a close. To the tools that can best assist an all-rounder storyteller that exists in the personal and emotional side of storytelling with the traditional side of storytelling. And that's through modes of persuasion. The story you're trying to tell, you're trying to persuade someone of something through an ethical appeal, a logical appeal, or an emotional appeal. The ethical appeal of a story is important, rather as the foundation, in that an audience will not listen or read a story or watch a story or an article or an artwork or a fictional character. They won't engage with any of that if they don't trust them. Ethical appeal investigates the credibility of a story being told. And you as an author need to think about, am I the authoritative voice of this particular narrative, of this particular community, of this identity that I'm trying to represent in my story? Does the story stand on a foundation of good faith? Or is it the reverse of that, in very clearly establishing that you are challenging or presenting a story of untrustworthiness or presenting a story of bad faith? And depending on your audience, you need to unpack the logic behind that particular choice, bringing us to the logical appeal of a story. The ethics of the author is the foundation of the story they tell, is the foundation of the characters that they write, the politics they engage with, the truths that they engage with. The logic is unpacking those ethics in driving that story forward. What defines the action? What defines the logic of why the character does what they do and why you're telling that story? Logic supports the author or the artist or the storyteller's perspective that seeks to either challenge or support an audience member's logic or reasoning that they come into when they're consuming their story that you're presenting to them. Then lastly, we have the emotional appeal of the story, which is speaking to the heart. I spoke about marrying the heart and the brain. Emotional appeal really works when you're trying to communicate logic. Logic is best communicated when it's wrapped up in sympathy and passion and fear and hopes and dreams and values and beliefs, and experiences. Communicating in that manner goes back to knowing your audience's prejudices and expectations and interests, because it's easier to evoke emotion if you demonstrate an agreement with what your audience comes in with, or an admission of being wrong. And depending on how you design your narrative, this may be a clever tool in disarming an opposing narrative. And doesn't that sound like something that a political strategist would say? And that brings me to the last point that I'm going to drive home, because I'm running out of time. You've laid out in detail structures of truth, your intention as a storyteller with the audience. And let's put the ball in the box of how that is married with strategies from other disciplines that are not creative. What a journalist would do as a storyteller, what a public relations consultant or specialist would do as a storyteller or as a political strategist. And a journalist in particular, and I know there might be one or two journalists in this room, looks at a story from a place of disseminating information that is for public consumption, that has to be accessible and objective, looking at both sides of a story and being aware of 5 basic things. Journalist as storyteller looks at awareness, especially when they're dealing with something that's controversial or political. They're very wary of presenting an overly simplified conception of what the story is. They're often very wary of a particular framing from a person and the ethical appeal that it has to presenting a particular frame to an audience, because there's dangers of personal truth and personal truth intersecting when you come from a personal point of view and you're not aware of it. So pause and always ask yourself as a storyteller, what have you already bought into before exploring the story that you want to look at or the subject matter that you want to engage with? What's your hypothesis on it? If I can be scientific. Your starting point is in talking to yourself. What is your hypothesis on this problem, on this matter? And what could possibly render my hypothesis or view of this matter as wrong? And how would an alternative view or hypothesis tell the story that you're trying to tell? I want to tell it in one way. How does the opposing view then tell that same story? Because then you're in a better position to engage with the 3 truths politically, personally, objectively, and you can come out on the other side, not as wrong as you might have been coming from a purely personal place. Then it's easier to map out discourse. It's easier to look at information and evaluate data, look at other perspectives, and be more transparent in the form of storytelling that is not or doesn't have a direct bibliography. Because in the creative writing or the creative arts, we're not academic. There's no bibliography that the audience gets at the end. They take what you tell as a story at face value as something to believe in. So you have to take the care to do the data, do the research, and be transparent about transparent with yourself and how you engage with that information. From a PR lens, or rather the lens of a PR specialist or consultant, they want to maintain a favorable image for the audience, right? How a client of theirs appears, behaves, or expresses an image for public consumption, trying to maximize positivity, but also mitigating any damage that might come with it. And when constructing a 3-dimensional character, that's not particularly personal, right? If it's not a story that's based on your life fictionally, when you're trying to write characters that are outside of your identity and your politics, it might be an interesting exercise to look at that character as a PR client. How do I present this person in public? How do I present them authentically? How do I not present them as an archetype or a stereotype? What is their appeal? Who are they appealing to? What makes them appealing to another character? Or what makes them appealing to an audience member that you might agree with or you might not agree with? What kind of awareness are you trying to create through that character? And what actions does that character take to gain dignity and respect from the audience and the other characters in the play, if there are other characters in the story that you're trying to tell? Now, lastly, last one is the storyteller as a political strategist, which is the most tricky. It is the most dangerous one because we all have our personal politics. And politics is always about influencing an audience member, a constituency, a group of people to think in a particular way. And I stress this, please. The truth being communicated is so important, because politics and personal truth interact here and create some dangerous lines, especially when you're dealing with narratives when it comes to sexuality, race, public governance, and what is trendy at the time. You need to find an equilibrium of persuasion, logic, emotions, and ethics. And a political consultant at a basic level will look at number one. What am I trying to acquire with the story? Am I trying to acquire or develop power through the story? Are you trying to develop or acquire power to gain an advantage in telling a story of conflict or advancing an agenda? You look at what problem is my story trying to tell? Is my story trying to solve a problem? And is it trying to look at who are the problem solvers and the problem causers? What is my ideal as a storyteller? What is my ideal vision of the world that I'm trying to tell? And who benefits from the story that I'm trying to tell? And who's negatively affected by the story that I'm trying to tell? How do different people and groups engage with the story that I'm telling? And am I constructing, or rather designing, a narrative to create power, to gain power, to create mutual benefit for the audience members, to create conflict? Or is it to maximize the potential for the audience member to engage with their personal truth? And depending on which narrative you're trying to create, there are various ways of achieving that. Now, in closing, because I must wrap this up, all those occupations are storytellers in the realm of critical thinking, and applying these tools in exploring the truth, exploring modes of persuasion, traditional structures of storytelling. I hope that this assists you as a storyteller in communicating your story with a clear intention and instilling a greater sense of responsibility in designing your narrative. Because at the end of the day, I'm speaking about effectively communicating something, right? But effectively communicating something doesn't mean that it's right or wrong or even the truth for it to be effective. So there's a lot of power in recognizing how you effectively communicate to someone. So please take the necessary care as a storyteller, because your job is very important in understanding the world and the cultures we live in. And I thank you very much.
Thank you, Tiisetso. There were so many wonderful nuggets in there, even for me, who's not strictly a storyteller, but in the way I think about my work. And thank you so much. I love your approach to storytelling, and especially creating that sense of danger and the responsibility as well. I agree with that. Everyone who's joined us, we'd love to hear your comments, any questions. Would you like to come on and chat with Tiisetso?
I just switched on the ring light because it's dark now.
You're shining. You're shining.
I know it's a lot. There was a lot to consume today. So people might be like, yep. I need to think about how I'm telling my stories now. I might not have any questions.
I'll jump in there. Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, that was a different, I don't know what I was expecting, but I definitely was not expecting that angle. Only because I think the thing that I hear often when people talk about the possibilities of storytelling or innovation in storytelling, there is a rush or a quickness to sort of grab other forms of mediums or media to sort of enhance the tools that we already have. When we think about innovation in storytelling, people are often quick to think about technology or lighting or all these external factors that will sort of enhance or elevate the medium of storytelling. And I guess what you did today was sort of look at more of the internal factors that could potentially help us to think about innovating or restructuring the ways that we think about constructing characters and stories differently, using other tools of communication that are already there, that already exist, you know, things that we see in politicians, in PR, in all of these other spaces where they use these tools to construct, you know, our leaders and different kinds of truths to make up a story that they want us to buy into ultimately. And so I found that incredibly refreshing to think about innovation from the inside versus the outside, you know, like, because I guess the world is also moving into a direction where people are realizing that we don't need more stuff, you know, that we don't need to pile on more things, that we have everything that we need to sort of construct or to tell stories. Yeah, I was also sort of very curious about what the beginning point is for you as a storyteller. Like, what is the tool or the thing that what is your beginning point, you know, like, yeah, what do you feel like if you go into a process in starting to construct a story, you feel like your process would be lacking without that thing?
Thank you, Koleka, for that comment and that particular question. I'm going to say that how I decided to look at the innovations in storytelling is from my own personal process, right? I mentioned before that I purposely decided to study philosophy and politics to help me try and understand how I could construct a storytelling narrative. And I always start off from a point of view of journalism, because I write quite politically charged work, and I know how easily misconstrued information can be. And I'm very aware of the particular symbols that people see in media, that people get from their families, that people hear from their friends. I'm very aware of what those symbols are and how they may interact with my own personal beliefs. So I try journalistic point of view first, objectively doing all the research necessary and looking at my own personal truths and political truths as a starting point in the story that I'm trying to tell. Because then after that, I'm quite clear on, okay, my politics as a Black woman means this. And if I'm trying to write a story about the color green, right? Green means A, B, C, D, E, F, G to me, but now I'm aware that green means A, B, C, D, E, F, G to this particular man, this particular group of people, this people in this particular country on this particular topic of the color green. I'm now aware of the truth, the various points of view of that particular truth, and my responsibility in making sure that those threads of that truth somehow come out in that story is always how I start off my process of creating a play, because I'm a playwright at the end of the day. And then picking up from Roxanne Gay in particular, ethical appeal, logical appeal, and emotional appeal. I mean, if you get all those things, that's my second starting point. How do I construct a character that touches the heart? How do I construct a character that speaks the facts about the thing? Because like I said, there's no bibliography for me as a storyteller. An audience member will watch the play and be like, yeah, that's what Tiisetso thinks. And what she thinks does not come from a place of reality. No, there's a logical appeal that I explain somehow through the narrative, or how I constructed, or my PRized character, the logical appeal of the story. And the ethical appeal is the baseline of how I choose to tell that story. How I'm going to tell the story about the color green to a community who looks at green as a color of the ANC, compared to how Irish people might look at it, compared to it being a symbol of American greed. Well, what are the ethics around that? So those are my two base starting points as journalist. Modes of persuasion are what I start off as in my creative writing is the questions that I first start off with, because you can take any of those things that I said and move them around as you see fit, but that's how I personally start them off. As a researcher, I'm very cerebral with this kind of thing. And then I get emotional later. I clean it up with the emotions later. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to steal that approach, by the way. So thank you for that.
Go ahead. It might make your story, your storytelling process a lot longer.
I don't mind.
Yeah, it creates a much cleaner, more considered, intentional product at the end that is more than just, these are my feelings and people must see them on stage.
Yeah, that's so important. We do have a couple more minutes if anyone wants to ask a question or just simply share a comment or say hi to Tiisetso. We've got about 5 minutes left. Anyone else? No more questions.
Molweni.
Naspa.
Hi. This is Communicator, and I'm using Nas's phone because my mic has a problem. So I had a question, and so the question is that, is it necessary to, for example, like do extensive research when you're writing like a story or a performance, like a play, or can you just take from like your own, like what you feel about a certain topic and just put it out there without being worried if whether people have more information about it or not? But it's just that I'm putting my opinion out there. And this is
How are you doing?
mine.
Hi, Nicolette. I think you're, there we go. Put it on mute. Thank you. Thank you, Mamkele, through NASPA's Zoom block. I don't think it's wholly necessary to do extensive research, right? Because then you can get yourself into a hole of being overwhelmed by all this information and feeling like you have to represent every single point of view on this particular topic. I don't think it's necessary in that regard. But I do want to emphasize that there's an importance of recognizing particular points of views and ways that people look at this particular topic beyond your own. Maybe not even you just putting it on stage, but just so you as a storyteller know that you are not representing a particular bias, putting on stage unnecessarily offensive symbols, things like that. So there needs to be some level of research that is done in presenting an objective point of view somewhere in your subjective narrative. Yeah, so you don't have to be ENCA journalist to tell your personal story, but just recognize it for yourself so you're prepared for what your audience might take from it. Yeah, that's my answer to your question. And it's nice to see your face.
Thanks for your questions, Mamkele. Naspa,
Yes.
did you have a question?
I'd like to say thank you, Mna. Thank you. Thank you.
Naspa, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who would like to share a question or comment before we wrap up? No takers. That's all good. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you for your time. If you did miss bits of it, we'll upload this on our website, manyanomedia.com. Sorry about that. Tiisetso, thank you again for your time, for your insights, for just sharing and being in community with us.
No, thank you guys. Like I mentioned at the beginning, you're doing fantastic, necessary work. People are going to be looking back on this in the future as a resource that was not there during my time in developing my storytelling.
Yes, that is absolutely the intention, and we want it to be as free and widely accessible as possible.
And thank you everybody in the Zoom room. Thank you. I see your smiling faces, whether it's camera off or your picture or whatever. I know you're smiling at me like I'm smiling at you.
Thank you, Tiisetso. Goodbye, everyone.